Our whole modern consumer culture is predicated on everyone remaining invisible, right? We're a service economy. Most jobs are in service work. You don't see hotel housekeepers who clean your room. You leave the room in the morning, it's filthy. You come back, it's, wow, this is so great. You know, like little angels cleaned it up. You know, you're served in a fast food place and, you know, you're supposed to have a 90-second turnaround time and it's just arms, right? You don't see a face attached. Even sometimes in a restaurant, you don't look at the waiter. You can't remember what your waiter or waitress looks like. It's just arms. So that service economy, feeds the way we look at fast fashion and the way we look at fast food. And I mean fast food now in terms of fast agriculture, not just McDonald's, but, industrially farmed berries, which are the leading produce item. For example, Walmart gets 1 in 4 American grocery dollars, and their leading item is berries. Right? And so those of us old enough to remember when berries were just a summer treat, we're so pleased that, it happened in my adult lifetime. Writing this book, I thought all this stuff happened in my adult lifetime. I wasn't really paying attention. All of a sudden, there were these beautiful berries year round, right? Where did they come from?
Welcome to the Real Organic Podcast. I'm Lindley Dixon, co-director of the Real Organic Project. We're a grassroots, farmer-led movement with an add-on organic food label distinguishing soil-grown crops and pasture-raised livestock under the organic seal. You just heard from Dartmouth college professor and labor historian Annelise Orleck. Annelise is the author of We're All Fast Food Workers Now, and in this episode she shares what she learned while doing research about the struggles faced by farm workers, as well as some of their organizing strategies and paths to victory. Please remember that if you'd like to support the work we do as we take on the money and power in industrial agriculture, you can visit our website at realorganicproject.org and sign up to become one of our 1,000 Real Friends. Now let's get back to the conversation between Dave Chapman and labor historian Annelise Orleck.
Welcome to the Real Organic Podcast, and my guest today is my old friend Annelise Orleck. Welcome, Annelise.
Thanks for having me, Dave.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. So, Annelise is coming. I invited her to talk about labor justice. Annelise has written a number of books. She's a professor at Dartmouth in the history department. And her last book was We're All Fast Food Workers Now. Let's start with that. We'll just dive in. How did that book get its name and what is it about?
Okay. The subtitle is The Global Uprising Against Poverty Wages. And the book got its title from an interview that I was doing with a bunch of labor activists in Florida. And the coalition was home health care workers, fast food workers, and adjunct professors, which seemed like an unusual labor coalition. And so I said that to them at one point. I said, for this old labor historian, this is a new kind of working class solidarity. How did you guys come together? And, the professors talked about how much they'd learned from the home health care workers and the fast food workers in terms of solidarity and strategy and, how to plan a protest and a strike. But one guy by the name of Keegan Shepard, who was at the University of South Florida, said, they tell us that our advanced degrees make us special, and if we're just quiet and we don't make trouble, then one day we'll get those secure tenure track jobs. He said, but that's just a lie to silence us, because the truth is we're all fast food workers now. So what does that mean? That means that, a generation or two ago, people were employees, often employees for a lifetime. They got benefits. They had a chance of mobility, in the company. They had, opportunities to prove themselves, prove their loyalty, but also prove their talent. In this generation, it's very different, from adjunct professors to grocery store workers to farm workers to, chemists in legal pot labs to whoever you think of, Uber drivers. Everybody is a contract worker, a so-called contract worker, with no security, with no benefits, with no, no coverage under labor laws, no coverage under overtime laws or, safety codes, health codes. None of that applies to them because they're not employees. They're independent contractors. And so that's what this graduate student, Keegan Shepard, meant. we're all fast food workers. It's the same. And indeed, professions we think of as really secure, such as the professoriate, are now poverty professions, highly insecure, people working 2-3 jobs just like fast food workers, finding themselves unable to pay rent, sleeping in their cars, driving Uber at night to make extra money, all of it. And so that's what that book is about. And it's about farm workers, retail workers, fast food workers, and small farmers, the people who work the land.
So for farm workers and fast food workers, this has basically always been true. I mean, there weren't fast food workers until maybe a generation ago,
Yeah.
but there have been a number of people in the world who have been treated very badly in the workplace, but you're suggesting that that number is growing now.
Yeah.
And that the professions that used to have protections from unions and from even from public awareness, that's changing.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think that we're seeing it very starkly right now during the pandemic because those who have been declared quote unquote essential workers, which means they can't stay home to work, they're required to go to work. They can be fired or, sanctioned if they don't go to work. Those essential workers are, everything from teachers to subway car drivers to farm workers. And farm workers are among the least protected, and they've suffered some of the highest rates of COVID because farm workers, especially migrant farm workers who are housed by farmers, tend to live together in bunkhouses. They eat at long tables, right? They even shower together. They work in the fields close together. And so the spikes in, everywhere from Florida to California to our own state of Vermont have often been in places where farm workers live and work together.
Yeah, they take buses to get to the work from the housing, yeah. So there's a story that you told me, and I've told it to a lot of people because I think it's such a powerful story. Could you talk about the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire and what the import was of that in American labor history?
So the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was a model, modern factory, garment factory in New York City in the early 20th century. And a lot of the women who worked there had been part of a major strike a couple of years earlier in New York called the Uprising of the 20,000. It was the biggest strike by women in American history at that time. And they had demanded many things: the right to unionize, limits on the hours that they worked during the day, and into piecework and some safety. And the union itself actually bargained away their final concern about the shops themselves and the grass linen. It was this very, very fashionable fabric that shirtwaists were made out of. It was one of the most popular and chic fabrics of the moment, and it was a kind of shiny, stiff linen that was incredibly flammable. And in the bargaining process, some of the union negotiators who were men agreed with the company owners. These women are always worried about dirty shops. This is a cosmetic issue. Well, in fact, what happened is when someone threw a cigar and it missed an ash can, one of the foremen threw a cigar on March 25th, 1911, the flame jumped out and the grass linen caught fire up and down the aisles of this factory. And, it burned so hot that, the women rushed. It was an 8-story building, 9-story building, and this was on the 7th, 8th, and 9th floors. So the 9th floor folks were able to get out when the building caught fire. The 7th floor folks were able to get down in the elevator. Those on the 8th floor in the middle were stuck. And so women rushed to the doors of the factory, but the doors opened in, not out, right? And so they their bodies piled up against the doors. One of the doors may have been locked, which the owners did to prevent so-called theft. And at the same time, so the doors were then blocked and women rushed to the windows. And they stepped out, and this young boy who worked in the shops, there's images of him. It was a horrifying image because it's a warm March afternoon in the middle of Manhattan in Greenwich Village, where then as now rich and poor lived fairly closely together. And he helped them out, and they jumped off of the 8th floor of the building, and the velocity by the time they came to the ground was so strong that the nets that the firemen had were worth nothing, and people crashed through. And so people in the city saw 146 young women die in half an hour. And it changed a lot. It changed a lot. It made real what had been existing for a long time in the American workplace, which was the frequency with which people died just going to work. And one of the people who watched that fire, who lived around the corner, was a social worker by the name of Frances Perkins, who would go on to become Franklin Roosevelt's labor secretary, the first woman cabinet member in the United States. And she vowed that she would spend the rest of her career working to make sure that nothing like this ever happened again. And with a lot of the workers who she befriended, and a lot of labor activists and the Roosevelts themselves, she became the architect of the American social welfare state, the Social Security Act, the Fair Labor Standards Act, the National Labor Relations Act that give workers the right to unionize. Fair Labor Standards protects, against, it's what gives us overtime, the weekend, protects against horrible conditions, all of it, unemployment insurance, workman's comp if you get injured on the job, in many ways arises out of Triangle. And this book arose out of the 100th anniversary of Triangle Fire.
So you've told me that, and you told me about the 100th anniversary, and I want to ask it, but before we go there, just to understand that this terrible event actually was a turning point in American labor history.
Yeah, it was.
And a lot of the success of building in laws to protect workers, a lot of the success of the unions came out of this catastrophe.
Yeah.
So it was a big deal.
It was a big deal. There were 6 young women who died who were never identified, and they had a funeral for these unknown victims. They were identified a few years ago, but at that time they weren't. And they had a funeral for these unknown victims, and 400,000 New Yorkers lined the streets, right? It was a powerful event in the life of the city. And these young women's bodies were arrayed in these makeshift morgues on the sidewalk. And for a couple of weeks, the people in the city saw family members of Triangle workers going by with lights and looking into the coffins and trying to identify the burned bodies and see if they could figure out who their relatives were. And it was a horrible, horrible sight. And it really did galvanize this consensus that it isn't okay to, as a country, we feel it isn't okay to expect people to put their lives on the line every single day, just to go to work, just to make a living. Yeah. And, and so Frances Perkins and some of those who were active in the strikes that led up to the fire that happened in the 2 years before the fire became active in trying to pass labor legislation. And it started in New York State under Governor Al Smith, who was the representative of the district where the fire took place and who visited the family of every single victim. So it was very personal for him. Under his administration in the late 1910s, Frances Perkins helped pass all these labor laws, and it went from New York to Illinois to Massachusetts. The industrial states began to pass laws protecting workers, and then when Perkins followed FDR to the White House in 1932, these laws became national. So,
and we'll go to the anniversary now, but the reason it was a big deal is because it touched people, not just the hearts of garment workers.
Right.
It touched the heart of our culture, and that people who weren't garment workers, people who weren't even in low-paying jobs, responded and said, this isn't right.
Right. Well, that's why it mattered that, there were people dying on the job all over the country, but mostly they were in hidden steel towns and coal mining towns and mill towns, and this took place in a chic Manhattan neighborhood on a warm March afternoon. So the estimate is that something like 10,000 people watched as these 146 young women died. In New York then, as it is now, along with LA, but really in New York was then the epicenter of media in the country. And so newspapers came, and there were photographs, and there were political cartoons, and there was a trial of the factory owners after the fire. And Harrison Blank, the factory owners, put the victims on trial. They do what's done now, right? Where they said they were these immigrants. They panicked. They were hysterical. They were, the Jewish workers are overwrought and hysterical. The Italian workers they called cows and said they were like bovine in their submissiveness. I mean, really nasty stereotypes. And they got off. I think they ended up paying something like $75 a family, which even then was an insult, to the people who'd lost loved ones in the fire. And so, yes, so the impact of the fire spread beyond, the usual workplace disaster.
Yeah. So let's go up 100 years, and you spoke at the anniversary, I think. So could you tell me about that, what that was like?
Well, I put it together along with artists and labor people in New York. And one of the things that we were concerned about is the fact that the Triangle Fire is taught as a turning point. It's when I used to do professional development lectures for history teachers, K to 12, they all wanted to talk about the fire because it made the past real in a profound way for their students. And we talked about a lot of ways that one could teach such a difficult topic. But the story always was that this was a triumphal event, right? That it was our reminder of the bad old days, before unions, before labor laws, before safety protections. And so what those of us, and again, union people, artists, historians, what we wanted to convey is that in the 21st century, in 2011, there were many, many people working in jobs that were just as dangerous as those in the Triangle era. And so the book really had its start in this moment when Kalpana Akhtar, who's the leader of a movement of garment workers in Bangladesh, where many of our clothes are made all over the world. Bangladesh is the second largest clothing exporter in the world. She got up on the stage where 100 years earlier, the strike of the 20,000 had started. And it was very emotional because she evoked the spirit of Clara Lemlich, who started that strike by jumping up and interrupting all these labor leaders and all these people who told the women not to strike, and jumped up on the stage and said, I have something to say. I am one of those girls whose suffering you're talking about, and I move, we go on a general strike. And everyone threw their big hats in the air and they went off on strike. So Kalpana Akhtar, was coming from Bangladesh, where there'd been an incredible movement of hundreds of thousands of garment workers, striking, shutting down highways to the ports where the garments our clothing is shipped out all over the world, and experiencing fires, many, many of them. And she got up on stage and she said, I have something to say. And she looked out into the audience, in the first row of which was the 95-year-old daughter of Clara Lemlich, who had stood up 100 years earlier. And she said, in Bangladesh, it's not 2011, it's 1911. And what she meant by that was that in terms of what workers' wages could buy, the hours they worked, the safety conditions, the disrespectful conditions, the sexual violence on the shop floor, all of it was no better than in 1911. And so that's where I really kind of was electrified, and other people got up to speak who were also in the world's most dangerous jobs: taxi drivers, fish plant processors, these women who worked on what they called the slime line in Mississippi catfish plants spoke. Coal miners, still one of the most dangerous professions in the world. And, as they all spoke, I began to think about the labor conditions around the world. And everywhere I went, I found that it's 1911 all over the world, including in the United States. The globalization of agriculture, garment work, and electronic production, so many of the industries that are central to our current way of life, has meant that the conditions, there's been a race to the bottom, lowering wages, lowering safety conditions, and all of that has come back home, right? And so for American workers as well, it has driven down wages, it has made safety conditions worse. And so one of the theses of the book is that we've gone back 100 years in terms of labor rights, in terms of what wages can buy, in terms of all of it. And that's kind of hard for us to imagine because we think of, this country as a kind of beacon of progress. And we're living in a very, very different moment right now, although the crises of the hour, the COVID pandemic, the climate change crisis, and the rise of fascism maybe have moved us to a point where, we're going to start looking back 75 or 80 years to the New Deal and, that era and say, okay, we need to rebuild again.
Yeah. So it seems that part of why we have lost so much of progress that was made. Part of it is that so much of the work has been exported.
Yes.
So instead of the garments being made in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, where now you can't even afford a tiny closet of an apartment, you know, they're being made in Bangladesh. And the people who are struggling and being paid slave wages and dying in fire still, the people in America who are the biggest consumer of the products being made don't see them.
Right.
And that's the really dark side of this international economy, which
Yes.
is that ability to move people's hearts. It's much harder when you're around the world and they can't imagine you the way they can imagine the person they see on the street in the city that they live.
That's why Cal Pony used the Triangle Fire anniversary to draw attention to Bangladesh, because it is such an important turning point for so many people in this country. And she knew that, you're right, I mean, we are the biggest consumers of fast fashion in the world. And Europe is, you know, comes right afterwards, and some of the wealthy Asian cities. And all of us buy, I think in this country we buy 5 times the amount of clothing we bought in 1980, right? Because clothing is now a disposable commodity.
Because
right?
it's so cheap.
Because it's so cheap.
Because they're not paying the people who make it.
Yes.
And because they're not paying for the environmental consequences of the way they make it.
Yes.
And on and on. And that's where, of course, we're having this discussion in the Real Organic Project about how food is grown. And there is a strange thing in our culture, which is almost a moral imperative, that if it's cheaper, it must be better.
Right.
You must be smarter if you're making it cheaper. You're working harder if you're making it cheaper. And actually, what it means most of the time, as far as I can see, is the people who are doing the work are getting paid less. They're less safe. They're less protected. The animals are abused. The land is abused. The climate is abused. So let's talk about agriculture a little bit. You definitely got into talking about American farm workers in your book. So could you talk about that? How did you come to that? Like, how did you pick, okay, I'm going to go look at farm workers in California?
Okay. You know, one of the things that became clear to me, I want to come back to something you raised a minute ago, which is this issue of invisibility. Our whole modern consumer culture is predicated on everyone remaining invisible, right? We're a service economy. Most jobs are in service work. You don't see hotel housekeepers who clean your room. You leave the room in the morning, it's filthy. You come back, it's, wow, this is so great. You know, like little angels cleaned it up. You know, you're served in a fast food place and, you know, you're supposed to have a 90-second turnaround time and it's just arms, right? You don't see a face attached. Even sometimes in a restaurant, you don't look at the waiter. You can't remember what your waiter or waitress looks like. It's just arms. So that service economy, you know, feeds the way we look at fast fashion and the way we look at fast food. And I mean fast food now in terms of fast agriculture, not just McDonald's, but, you know, industrially farmed berries, you know, which are the leading produce item. For example, Walmart gets 1 in 4 American grocery dollars, and their leading item is berries. Right? And so those of us old enough to remember when berries were just a summer treat, we're so pleased that, you know, it happened in my adult lifetime. Writing this book, I thought all this stuff happened in my adult lifetime. I wasn't really paying attention. All of a sudden, there were these beautiful berries year round, right? Where did they come from? In the same way that there were suddenly all of these cheap, colorful clothes, you know, that cost less than I had paid for clothing 20 years earlier. So I started to think about, I wanted to trace in the same way that I wanted to talk to hotel housekeepers and see who really cleans the rooms, right? And then I wanted, you know, to learn more about the lives of the Bangladeshi and Cambodian workers who make our clothes. I wanted to have some sense of who the farmers were. And as far as farm workers, I started in California in a kind of almost random way because an old friend of mine, my oldest friend, was working for a group called the Mixteco Community Organizing Project, Mixteco Indígena Community Organizing Project in Ventura County, California. And everyone who worked for that project was an indigenous migrant farm worker from Oaxaca. And when I started to talk to them, it was really fascinating because it was the history in some ways of how California became the center of industrial agriculture, feeding most of the nation, in particular fruits and berries. And so I interviewed a family, the Lopez's, Arsenio Lopez, who's the director of MyCop, this community organizing project, his mother Anastasia, and he talked about his grandparents. And his grandfathers came in the 1950s and 60s through the Bracero project. Bracero means arms, right? Farm workers, it's just what I was talking about. Farm workers were reduced to arms, right? We invited these strong arms to come and harvest our food. And, Braceros had no right, no path to citizenship. They didn't have a right to labor laws we were talking about earlier, a minimum wage. But they did have a right to be in the country. And they would come and work, and then they'd be taken back over the border, and they'd go back to Oaxaca. And that worked for a while to enable them to supplement their own farms, because one thing that I learned in this book is that most farm workers are farmers originally, right? And they're farmers who've lost their land or their farms for one reason or another. And so,
This time you're talking about is around when?
50s, 60s.
The 50s and 60s.
Right.
So a lot of people are coming up from Mexico primarily.
Yep.
And working the land because they'd lost their farms.
Yes.
And then going back to Mexico.
Yes. Well, they still had their farms. The Bracero program worked. They'd come up for a few months. They'd work on, very, very penal, carceral kinds of conditions in these, almost prison-like labor camps. But people liked the fact that they didn't have to sneak over the border. It was a legal situation. They did have certain rules and regs about how they would be paid. So they went back and enabled them to support their farms in Oaxaca and other parts of Mexico, right? It enabled them to buy the seed, and do the farming, as you know better than I, is a debt profession, right? You don't get paid until you sell your crops. And so it enabled them to have the money to go through the season. And it worked to some extent. Then the Bracero program was ended, but they still needed the workers. So it was kind of an unspoken agreement between big California agriculture, including the Ryder brothers and Driscoll berries, which was growing at that time, that they would help people sneak across. And so then Arsenio's father and mother came across, and they picked strawberries and lettuce. And strawberries came to be known as red gold. It became clear very quickly how much money you could make from industrially grown strawberries. Now, the other thing that they did is Driscolls helped Mexican-American families and Japanese Americans, sometimes coming back from the camps whose lands had been stolen, to share crop, right? There'd be a kind of land they had to buy Driscoll starts, they had to, sell through Driscolls, everything, they were completely tied in. But it did, it gave them a certain kind of farm. And Arsenio's father and mother would come, and other people of their generation. So now we're talking 70s and 80s. And Arsenio said his father, every time La Migra, the border patrol came, he'd have to hide in a hole in the ground. They would have holes in the farm, and the workers would go, and they would literally go underground and be covered over, so that the border patrols wouldn't deport them. And there was lots of bribery because this was a deal that big agriculture was making. So they probably knew where they were, and they'd probably been paid off. But so that was that, and it was hard, right? It was hard. Arsenio talked about the humiliations and the ways in which, in the Bracero program, his grandfathers were made to strip naked, and they were deloused, in these long lines of people, and how humiliating it was. And he felt really badly. That was doubled when they came and worked on some of these even Mexican-American owned farms because they were indigena, right? And so the racial prejudice of mestizo Mexicans toward indigenous people came out in the way they were treated. And then as Driscoll's, let's just say, and Anacapa, the two big berry companies in California, grew and grew, they needed ever more labor. But in the last, since Proposition 187 in California in the 90s, began to really criminalize and deny services to undocumented immigrants, it became harder and harder for people to get across. So Arsenio is of this recent generation. Everybody I talked to in the current farm workers, all of them walked across the border. They all ended up in a situation where they were legal. By the time Arsenio, so the third generation of this family coming to pick strawberries, was able to come, he it took something like 10, 15 years for his visa to clear. His father was given amnesty under Ronald Reagan's 1986 amnesty, I think between 3 and 5 million people. I think 3 million people were given amnesty, and then with their families, about 5 million people were able to stay legally. So Arsenio should have...
Was that with a green card or citizenship?
They got a path to citizenship.
Yeah.
So the Immigration Reform and Control Act, IRCA, became a way that people could come out of the shadows. And but at the same time, it was accompanied by a crackdown. And so that's when you started to have to show your passport when you were hired, and workplaces started being raided after that. It was a, kind of a Faustian bargain, although very important for those people who got amnesty. And now we look back and, there's never been that kind of wholesale amnesty of farm workers since that time. But Arsenio turned 21, he got the flu. Right when he finally got a visa. And while he had the flu, before he got better, he turned 21. And so he no longer had a right to come as his father's child, even though his father was now a citizen. And so he walked across the border. And for me, one of the most moving things was listening to the stories of how people came, and what they suffered, and how they were exploited by absolutely everyone, by the coyotes, the guides on that side who they paid, by the Mexican police, by the American Border Patrol, by the employers who smuggled them in vans, when they got here and put them in terrible living conditions, and my cop was really inspiring for me because they were of a generation that had had enough, and they started organizing. And I talked to a guy named Bernardino Martinez who found that farm workers in California were being policed by these fake militaries. They were actually private guards. It's what's happening in the polling places today in Virginia with these fake military guards. Anyway, these companies would hire private security and have them dressed so that the workers who were new to this country and frightened of being deported thought that they had actually sent soldiers, U.S. soldiers, and police into these fields. And they hadn't. Anyway, Bernardino was organizing for the United Farm Workers and to try to get these farm workers covered by the California Labor Relations Act. Farm workers never had the rights that other workers won in the 1930s after Triangle. They were always treated differently. And but in California, the farm workers who organized at the UFW in the 1970s were able to win a California Agricultural Labor Relations Act. So he was trying to win for these indigenous workers in 2012 those same rights, and he was literally tasered. Right? They were tasering workers in the fields who they thought were organizing, who they thought would get up off their knees and start to speak. And he was literally tasered, and he took the case to county court in Ventura County, and he won. The company was sanctioned, and he described to me the day that police actually accompanied him to go back to work. And, he's walking up this row with the berries on both sides and the workers looking at him. And he said it felt like a movie. And he said it was very powerful because they looked at them and he wasn't killed and he wasn't deported, right? And he was tasered, but he wasn't beaten the way they might have thought he would be. And so, they began to organize more after that. And some of the most inspiring strikes that I've seen in modern times took place among berry workers on the West Coast from 2012 to 2015. And I've been talking for a while, so I'll let you ask a question. But that also drew me in. I was fascinated by that and what happened. How do you get 50,000 berry pickers to go on strike? It was really something.
Yeah. So who were they striking against?
So there was an interesting wave of strikes that actually started among grape pickers in South Africa in the Western Cape. There's these women who really are the backbone of the wine industry in South Africa. And they went on strike in 2012 because they were being paid in alcohol, and they wanted to be paid in money. And they were being paid a family wage, which meant that the husband was paid, and they weren't being paid for their labor separately. And they were also struggling against domestic violence and alcoholism, and they wanted to have their own money. And they were also being paid a fraction of what they were worth. So their strike spread, and in a few days it was 16,000 workers, really the most marginalized workers in South Africa. And by the time it was done, they'd set fields on fire, and they had doubled their wage. And the unions were shocked because the unions were male-dominated and they didn't take them seriously. And by the end, they were seeing one of the big labor events in recent South African history. And interestingly enough, these blueberry pickers, these indigenous blueberry pickers in Washington State for Sakuma berry, saw videos on their cell phones. They were being sent videos by these workers, and they were really fascinated, and they began to organize. And so, inspired by this strike half a world away, they began to organize, and they went on strike repeatedly against Sakuma berry. And Sakuma berry was one of those companies that was hiring fake military guards like Anacapa, strawberries in California. And they started a new kind of labor union. It wasn't the United Farm Workers, which, its history got complicated and they didn't feel represented by them. At the very least, they felt that that was a group that was biased in favor of mestizos, and they wanted an indigenous farm workers union. So they started it, and it started to spread down the West Coast. And so we have, the California, Ventura County people, and then the most amazing part of the strike took place across the border in Baja California, where most of the berries for Walmart were grown, for Costco. And these were these vast farms in Baja. And the workers went on strike in the spring of 2015 over water, right? That's one of the issues that's really central to these movements that I've looked at. They had no access to clean water. They had to pay for water. They were bathing their children in polluted, toxic water. And so the strike was for water, for starters. And they were getting, $6 a day for their work, for these 12-hour days. And
State of California.
No, Baja California, across the border. It's a state of Mexico.
Baja California is Mexico.
Baja California is Mexico.
Okay, thank you.
And it's over the border. And they showed that just over the border in the U.S., in San Diego, a very affluent California city, a gallon of milk cost the same as it cost across the border in San Quintin, where many of these farms were. And they said, okay, so if the cost of food and housing is similar to what it is in California, you really understand what it means to pay people $6 a day.
What would somebody in the state of California be getting paid at that time?
The farm workers?
Yeah, the
farm workers were getting, the lucky ones were getting $8 or $9 an hour. So, many of them were getting less. But, and many of them, I can get into the conditions in California in a minute and why they were paid less. They were paid often by the box, not by the hour, which, sped up labor and which, made things better for young, strong people. But as you got older and more tired, it was harder to make a living. Anyway, the strike in San Quintin was incredible. It spread across the peninsula, just like the Western Cape grape strike in South Africa, and the government sent in these tanks that were called sharks, and the sharks went through knocking down the worker shacks and sowing terror in their families and among their children. And you had children bathing in this toxic water and getting terrible sores and illnesses. And so they just got mad, and they marched to the border and the Pan American Highway, and ultimately 50,000 people were out on strike. They were burning vehicles and leaving them in the middle of the roads to stop the buses from going. And the strike went on for months. And what was really interesting is that ultimately there was intervention by Walmart, which negotiated with the governor of the state of Baja California to try to get these folks recognized so they could get payment into Social Security benefits. They could get, somewhat of a living wage. Their wage went up to 11 something a day, and recognition of their unions. And so they realized something that's become really key to farm workers all over, including farm workers, dairy workers in Vermont, right? That you can't just squeeze the farmer, right? Because the farmer, in these cases, it was industrial agriculture, in the case of Driscoll's, but, in a lot of cases, even Sakuma berry, which was, it's the biggest blueberry grower in the country, but, farmers were going out of business, right? They realized that in many cases they needed to look at who the biggest buyers were. And that's what Florida tomato pickers did too. They started to look at who are the big buyers. So the Florida tomato pickers targeted fast food restaurants. Taco Bell was the first to settle. The berry pickers targeted Walmart, and Walmart again. They knew that Walmart needed those berries, right? It wasn't worth it to them to have that strike. So and in this state, Migrant Justice, the dairy workers organization, targeted Ben and Jerry's and now Cabot and Hannaford's, the biggest buyers of milk and cream in Vermont.
How much of the concern on the part of things like Walmart are about the social media campaign as opposed to just, well, we can't get the berries, but now millions of people, our customers, are saying we look very bad?
It's all of it. Social media has fueled this global uprising against poverty wages that my book is about because you don't have to wait for professional media to cover an event, right? And so you can make McDonald's look bad by having a mock trial of Ronald McDonald for his crimes on the streets of Tokyo, right? And you can make Walmart look bad. What's interesting though is that Walmart has actually played an important role in making standards better for agricultural workers. They also signed the Fair Food Agreement with the Florida tomato pickers. The Immokalee workers. And when they did so, it was so important to global agriculture that the UN Special Rapporteur for Agricultural Labor Conditions came and witnessed the signing and talked about how we could, scale up this fair food program. For their own workers, no. I mean, Walmart is historically awful to their own workers, and they are one of the stories in my book. But it is interesting that the agricultural workers targeting Walmart were successful, right? In that Walmart was willing to agree to pay farmers a little more for their produce if they guaranteed a certain minimum wage, living standards for agricultural workers, zero tolerance for sexual violence in the fields, and the right to organize. So I think that's really interesting. Walmart doesn't recognize the right to unionize of its own workers in the United States, right? But they did sign that deal with Florida tomato growers, and they did help the berry pickers in Mexico and up the West Coast.
Yeah. All right, so this is so interesting because these are the people who grow our food.
Yep.
These are the people who plant and harvest the food that we eat. And, it's interesting. There's so much appropriate discussion right now about the loss of farmers of color in America. And what everyone is talking about when they say that is they mean farmers who own their farmland, right. Farm owners of color.
Right.
And it is an important subject, and it's been a terrible thing that's happened. But the vast majority of people who farm in this country are people of color.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
As is in the world.
In the world.
But in this country too, they're mostly, I don't know, are they mostly undocumented?
Yeah.
So the majority of these farm workers are undocumented.
The majority of farm workers around the world, of migrant farm workers, are undocumented because they're part of this epic global migration. It's 14 million people right now. And no, it's more than that. It's 1 in 14 people on Earth who are on the road because they have lost their farms, because they have lost their lands, because of political violence, because of war. And many of them were farmers. Most of them were farmers before they got on the road, and they're the ones who supply labor for bigger farms all around the world.
I heard Al Gore give a talk 2 days ago about the impact of climate change on agriculture, and he was just talking about the huge number of people being pushed off the land right now because they literally can't survive where they are.
Yeah. And it's not just that. I mean, one of the least covered, most important stories of our recent age is the global land grab after the 2008 crash, when McKinsey and other analysts were telling business people, invest in land. And land changed hands, particularly in Africa and South Asia and Southeast Asia, at a rate that was just staggering. Parcels the size of countries, right? Land, was taken away from people. I think in one area in Southeast Asia, it's the size of New Zealand. It's that much land, right? In another, there's a parcel the size of Italy. And a lot of it is Chinese investment. It's these farms that exist on a scale that we can't even imagine. And then there were, big corporate investors, from the United States and other parts of the world too. So many farmers lost their land as a result of the 2008 land grab that, they really fueled this global migration. Similarly, before that, to go back before that, NAFTA, right? Donald Trump talks about all the ways in which the North American Free Trade Agreement harmed American producers. It harmed Mexican producers way more. It was something like 1 in 10 farmers there lost their farms, lost their land. The number of people who came across the country doubled. Across the border to our country doubled. So, and the reason also was that, Mexico was flooded with cheap bioengineered American corn. And so all of these small Oaxacan growers who'd been able to survive on their, there were so many species. I think there were 2,000 species of corn in Oaxaca, all different, all grown, with a proprietary, style, and all with different taste and nutritional value. And, one of the things that happened is that the bioengineered corn, when it started to be planted in the mountains there, destroyed the indigenous corn. So all of that is part of what's happened to small farmers, and why small farmers are part of this global movement, epitomized by a group called Via Campesina, the Peasant's Way, the Farmer's Road, which they said, people who work the earth. They don't differentiate between farm workers and farmers who own their land. They feel like they're in the same struggle, and that they're the proprietors of the earth, right? So that they have a responsibility to fight climate change, but also that they have certain rights as the stewards of the land.
Yeah. So, of course, one of the things that we're dealing with in the Real Organic Project is the colonization of the organic brand by industrial agriculture, by huge corporate enterprises. They have tremendous amount of influence, and they can talk to the senator anytime they want. So I'm curious, for these big strikes, could you say, when we talk about Driscoll's, biggest berry company in the world, over 50% of the berries sold in the world are Driscoll's berries. Yeah. 70% of the organic berries are Driscoll's berries. Wow. Unbelievable monopoly. So I'm curious, so the conditions for a Driscoll's organic production unit wouldn't be any better or worse than for a non-organic one. It's all the same?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about Swanton Berry in Santa Cruz, which attempted to be the first union organic strawberry farm in the United States, and they really, the folks who ran that farm, kind of came out of 60s hippie collective agriculture. Really, they said it was their workers who led them to believe that, you can't produce a healthy product that's healthy for the world by, creating a labor environment that's unhealthy for your workers, right? That it's all of a piece. You have to think holistically. So, and he really struggled. He said he really struggled to talk to other organic farmers and also organic consumers. He said it was really hard to get organic farmers to believe that labor justice was part of the project. And I think that's something we've talked about, and that is really very much on the table right now, right? How do you identify food in terms of labor justice? I've struggled, with our food co-op. I've struggled, with other sellers of organic food to ask them to label these foods not just as organic, but in terms of the kinds of conditions that that workers are subject to. And, the one area in which I think things may be better for organic producers, sometimes is because the stuff that's sprayed on non-organic berries is so toxic to the earth and the atmosphere, and no one has suffered more from that than farm workers and their children, who was born with birth defects and hydrocephaly and all kinds of terrible stuff. So, but there's another dimension.
Even industrial agriculture, organic agriculture, is better than industrial chemical agriculture.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
absolutely, let us celebrate that. Yeah, I'm sorry. So go ahead.
Yeah, but in the way that, let's say, industrial organic agriculture attempts to control, the way in which, for example, all those sharecropped farms that Driscoll's feeds to and Anacapa feeds to, where they have to use their starts, their methods, their soil, their chemicals, their pesticides. I mean, that is reproduced around the world. And as a result, real organic farmers, and some of those who are the leaders of Via Campesina, like an organic rice farmer from Zimbabwe named Elizabeth Mopofu, talk about how, one of the things they always did was have seed exchanges, right? They would have seed repositories. They would keep the very best seed. The experts in seed would go out and pick, the seed at the end of the season and figure out the very best seed, and they'd save it, and they would, they would figure out what grew best under those conditions and what produced the most flavorful and the most, pest resistant and the most cold resistant kinds of crops. And, that element of farming, which is organic farming in the truest sense of the word, in places like the Philippines, where it's been going on with rice at the rice terraces for 2,000 years, and in Africa and in Haiti, it started to disappear because, again, you got these bioengineered seeds that the government would buy from, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank would say, okay, you can have loans to get out of debt if you buy these Monsanto seeds, and then you distribute them to your farmers. So they would distribute them and say, you guys have to grow with these. And, the farmers would ultimately unintentionally destroy the wild breeds of rice, for example, which is one of the, like corn, one of the crops whose biodiversity disappeared. So I'm really interested in them because they call it agroecology, but they are, they're organic farmers in all of these places. And so seed exchange has become a form of civil disobedience. That was one of the most fascinating little facts I came across in this book. All across Africa and Asia, they're having seed exchanges when it's against the law because, Monsanto is claiming intellectual property rights for their seeds. So there is a real organic project going on in Zimbabwe, and it's going on in the rice terraces outside of Manila. It's really interesting. Yeah. And in India.
Yeah. Certainly, everything that we're trying to do is part of an international movement. We are literally the market for much of the world, and so a lot of the rest of the world is selling into America. And we have so much influence over things like, obviously, the chemical agriculture comes from American industry, but so does a lot of the organic standards, which is why so many people in the world are concerned about what's happening in America.
Yeah.
Because they know if America says this or that is allowed, they're not going to be able to hold the line forever. They're going to try. But it's going to be very hard.
What's interesting is that what saved the rice cultivators in the Philippine rice terraces, again, 2,000 years old, was being able to sell to this country with the label organic and being able to sell to Europe because they realized that people would pay more for heirloom organic rice, and that enabled people to have enough to stay on their land, right? And enough to, to convince their children, okay, we can build a better house, you can stay, we can get internet, right? We can get phone service, and you can stay and have a relatively modern life and make a living. So organic, even though the Philippine rice growers were practicing true organic, thousands of years before this country existed, right? The growth of organic agriculture and its markets in this country and in Europe, it was able to save them, now, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, that's right. And another reason why what we do is important and why the choices that we make as eaters affect how people are going to farm all over the world.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make a call out to Swanton Berry Farm. Jim Cochran
Jim Cochran, thank you, had blanked on his name.
is, a real pioneer. And I know when he started to have these conversations about labor out in California, he was kind of, a prophet in the wilderness. It was not popular because most farmers, organic or conventional, felt up against the wall to make a living. And now we're talking about paying the people more. And again, that movement has got to be coupled to a response in the marketplace. Yeah. The eaters have got to support better wages for farm workers in order for farm workers to get it, because there isn't much left otherwise.
Well, one of the things Jim Cochran became involved in later on is this project in California, which exists in many parts of the country now, these food policy councils, and called it something like the Real Vision Project. I don't think that's the right name, but it was a project that involved 200 growers in California, and it was trying to get state funds to subsidize the sale of organic produce so that people could afford it, on food stamps. And, that this is spreading as an idea all over the country. And I think it's an alternative to this kind of strictly capitalist market, right? To say, okay, it is in the interest of let's say, state governments to help preserve the health of its people, these states' peoples, and to help preserve the health of the land by keeping organic farms going, and to help, preserve small farming, right, to provide these subsidies and distribution points so that, sometimes it's as little as food stamps being accepted in farmers markets, and sometimes it's, drop-offs where, the food that poor people are getting is much less expensive than, organic food would normally be. So, I think we need to think in a broader way than a strictly consumer-producer mentality.
Yeah. It's exactly what they're doing in Denmark, of course.
Yes.
Those Danes. But, they are. So one of the things they've done is they've moved a lot of the institutional buying in Denmark to be as organic as possible. And that, of course, really helps, because they believe exactly what you said. It's better for all citizens for organic farmers to flourish, because there are so many secondary benefits in terms of water quality and air quality and community, social welfare, so that they've committed a fair amount of money to trying to take the country as much organic as they can.
That's great.
It's very inspiring.
And, to come back to your point about conscious consumers, that's one of those places with extremely conscious consumers as Sweden is. And so it's not accidental that, I feel like those consumers, for example, during the South African grape strike in 2012, the Robertson's winery, which was one of the worst and one of the last to settle, the consumers, pressured, and the labor unions in Denmark made the supermarkets take Robertson's wine off the shelves. And since they were the biggest market for South African wine, Denmark and Scandinavia in general, right, it then came back to the farm workers, right? And that it wasn't just, about the sale, though, in their country. Denmark said, okay, we'll put the bottles back on the shelves if you let us send our union reps to look at the labor conditions in your fields, right? Same thing in Sweden with H&M, the biggest fast clothing producer in the world. The reason why H&M is better, it's not great, but it's better than other companies in places like Cambodia and Bangladesh, is because their consumers have been really militant and kind of pressed the company to do that. So, we need all the parts. We need consumers, we need labor, we need government, we need conscious producers, conscious capitalists.
Yeah. I was going to ask you, what do you think we can do? I of course, get that question, and it's a daunting question, because it's not easy what any individual can do, except to get organized and to work together with other like-minded people and create our awareness. But what are your thoughts? You've been thinking about this a long time, Annelise.
Strictly in terms of produce, I think, supporting the businesses that have done right, by their workers, and convincing stores, which I've tried unsuccessfully to do, to really highlight those brands, right? To really highlight Swantonberry, to really highlight, Sukuma's unionized now. You can buy Sukuma blueberries again. There are unionized, tomato fields, and I think we just, it is incumbent upon us to not just say, oh wow, all these great new foods and clothing and all this stuff just appeared, and our rooms and hotels just get cleaned. It's incumbent upon us to be conscious and to learn, and to see that everything's interconnected. And I recognize that American wages overall have been stuck for 40 years. And it is only this living wage movement since 2012 of all these groups that I've been writing about that has started to nudge American wages up. And the fact that we could even talk about a national $15 wage, that if the Democrats win the election in 2 weeks, they're talking about a national $15 wage. That was thought to be crazy a couple of years ago. And so, sustained struggle, solidarity between, workers of different kinds. So one of the things that moves me so much is that Walmart workers, right, on their minimal salaries, chipped in to bring Kalpana Akhtar, the leader of the Bangladeshi garment workers who make the clothes sold in Walmarts, to the Walmart shareholders meeting so she could stand in front of the Walton family and say it would cost 1%, not of your corporate incomes, but of your personal annual incomes, 1% to make all the factories in Bangladesh safe so nobody had to die making clothes in this country, right? And I was so touched by the fact that you had Walmart workers who are so oppressed in so many ways themselves, standing together with the Bangladeshi garment workers and walking picket lines with them at the Children's Place in New Jersey with no more fires, not one more fire signs. So I just think we need a sense of our interdependence. It's not easy right now with 30 million Americans unemployed. We're obviously going to want to go for the cheaper stuff, right? But I think buying, clothing less frequently, buying berries maybe in the summer and freezing them, but also supporting, learning, digging in, seeing who treats their workers right. So very close to home, right? Migrant justice, the dairy workers recognized that Vermont dairy farmers probably couldn't afford much more than they were giving, that most of them were on the brink of disaster. So they went after Ben & Jerry's, the biggest buyer in Vermont and of milk and cream, and said, will you commit to paying more to the farmers who house workers in heated housing during a Vermont winter, who give them real beds, who pay them at least $10 an hour. They had a whole series of demands, and it took 2 or 3 years. But as Kiki Balcazar, who's the founder of Migrant Justice and an undocumented worker who came to Vermont at 16, said Ben & Jerry's, that's their market share, right? They're the conscious company. He said, you're conscious about bovine growth hormone, and you're conscious about, this and that, and organic soil and everything. And what about the people who milk the cows, who literally give you the cream you make your ice cream with? And it took a long time of embarrassing Ben & Jerry's, but ultimately they were able to, and Ben & Jerry's signed on, and now they're going after Hannaford's, and I think Cabot will probably be next. But I think embarrassing these corporations matters. And again, social media, we all have phones, right? You can actually have some impact on a corporation's bottom line. These guys were showing up, the tomato for the Immokalee workers, they were on a truth tour for 17 years, right? Trying to embarrass these companies and get some, and they did get some justice. And, the migrant justice folks were touring around the country in front of Ben & Jerry's stores, and everywhere Ben & Jerry's officials spoke, for 3 years, until they finally made a difference. Same thing with Nike, right? The Nike workers also, are still showing up in front of Nike to embarrass them. And Nike launched a whole big campaign to try to pretend that things were better. So all of it, we have a responsibility, and there's a lot that can be done. I mean, the one thing that I want to say is that, the federal judge who looked at one of the original cases of human trafficking in the tomato fields of Florida back when this all started in the early 2000s, said that the Florida tomato fields have gone from being what she called ground zero for modern slavery to a model agricultural workplace that we'd like to reproduce around the world. So these movements have been successful. And I think if we support them and we recognize that success is possible, then, otherwise it's easy to become overwhelmed. But success is possible, and we can eat foods that are healthy in every sense.
Annelise Orleck, that is a wonderful place for us to end. So thank you so much for coming over and talking.
Thanks, dear Dave.
Thank you for listening to the Real Organic Podcast. We hope that you'll subscribe, tell your friends, and leave us a rating and review for each episode that you enjoyed. A video version of this interview, as well as the full transcript with links related to our conversation, is found at realorganicproject.org/episode 33. Please join us next time for an interview with Frances Tickey. To find a Real Organic farm near you, visit realorganicproject.org/farms.